AI is not itself going to take jobs, right? It's that the people who know how to use AI, right, are going to have the advantage.
Hello, Daniel Glazer, and welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Sophia.
So, I know that you and I have known each other for ages, but my idea for this interview came up is because I was speaking to a contact of mine who's a venture capitalist in New York, and I was basically asking him, what do you think of the lawyers that you work with? Do you think that the lawyers that you've worked with as a VC, do they know enough about software? Do they know enough about venture capital? Because I've been doing some trainings for law firms, and so I just wanted to see, well, what do the clients think, right? Because that's at the end of the day kind of what matters. And he said, well, in general, they don't really know what they're talking about, apart from the people at Wilson, Sonsini, and Cooley. And I thought, I know them. I'm gonna call Daniel. And so, why do you think Wilson Sonsini has this reputation? Because literally, this guy said, well, they could teach us.
So I'm not going to be so presumptuous to say that we can always teach venture capitalists about technology, or certainly
Depends on the venture capitalist, right?
Well, I'm not going to make that. I'm not going to make that statement. But what I will say is that Wilson, and I would say, a group of mostly Silicon Valley headquartered law firms, I think, are very focused on working on high growth sectors, specifically tech and life sciences, right? And the model for a firm like Wilson, right, is to, and those other firms as well, is to work with those companies, often from early in their life cycle through late in their life cycle, the latest possible point of their life cycle, right? It is not uncommon to work with companies that are raising venture capital, scaling, exiting, to work with them, let's say at the seed or even incorporation stage, work with them on their various financings, maybe help them buy a company or two, and then eventually help them with their exit, either, let's say, a sale to a buyer or a US IPO. And then perhaps if it's a US IPO, continue to work with them as a public company, right? And if you're going to work with a company through that life cycle in that way and get involved with that company and their business, because as Sophia, as you may know, it is not uncommon for lawyers in the US, for venture-backed companies, to attend their board meetings on a monthly or quarterly basis, right? And the lawyers are viewed very often as a strategic advisor, right? Not just a, let's say, technical legal advisor, but as a strategic advisor to the business. You can't really do that without having an understanding of the company's business model, and then of course just the nature of its product or service offering, like the business model and the underlying technology that leads to the business model, right? How can you help a company properly as a strategic advisor unless you understand what it's doing? And maybe also importantly, how do you be a strategic advisor to a company if you can't help them see around corners a little bit, right? In other words, a firm like Wilson, we've been working with high growth companies since the early mid 1960s, right? I mean, the firm first started in 1961.
So that's the chip. That's when the chip.
Right.
That's basically the beginning of Silicon Valley with the silicon chips.
Right. And that's when the firm was formed, right? And that's when the first venture funds were formed. And that's not a coincidence, right? Is that the approach was, there are these early stage companies building very interesting technology businesses, and they need funding and they need strategic guidance on how to build, right? And that's where the VCs come in, and that's where a certain type of law firm comes in. And, that means that we've been doing this for 60 something years, right? And so when another company comes in and says, look, we've built now the better mousetrap. And it's our turn to go on that journey, raise money, build the company massively, right? Change the world, as they say. We've got that experience to say, look, this is how other similarly situated companies have done it in the past. And I think that what you've got in the US in particular is a relatively small group of law firms that is particularly focused on advising in that way and advising that type of company.
And so I'm just thinking, as a lawyer, like you've basically just now mentioned three skill sets. I mean, you actually have to know something about law, I'm assuming. So you went
It's
to
a
law
good
school.
assumption.
It's
A
a
good
good
assumption.
assumption,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then you also talked a lot about business. So I don't know, then you go and get an MBA, and then you got to also learn about technology. So how does that all fit basically into one lifetime? If you're learning all of this stuff, how how do you have any time to do actual work? What I mean is, like, how did you learn all of these? Because yes, you start with a law degree, and then what has to happen to a person who graduates from law school in order for them to become a strategic advisor to a tech client?
So look, part of it comes with the American model of training lawyers is that you go to 4 years of university and then you go to 3 years of law school, right? So it's a full 7 years until you even qualify to go out and practice. And there is no kind of, for the most part, there is no sort of legal or law major that you would take in university or in college, right? For those Americans listening. Um, it's more that, like, for example, I was a history major, right, in college, and I think you're
Excellent
sort of,
choice.
thank you. And I was encouraged, and I think a lot of people are encouraged really to to think outside the box a little bit and explore different areas of study, and a lot, and that's where a lot of people go to law school after that, right? Let's say that they might have been pre-med in college and decided actually that they want to go to law school, or they were in the arts, right, and decided that they wanted to go to law school. And very often those who go to law school will end up focusing their careers in law on areas that they were particularly interested in, may have explored in university, right? So, after 7 years of that study, what comes out more often than not is both an understanding, as they say in American law schools, an understanding of how to think like a lawyer. Not necessarily that you've memorized a body of law, but you've been taught, especially in those 3 years of law school, by what's called the Socratic method, where there's an ongoing back and forth, a Q&A, kind of a call and response with your professors, where you learn how to think on the spot and think critically. And, the right answer oftentimes, if you're, at least in the US, if you're an American lawyer, when somebody asks you a question, you may not know off the top of your head the specific legal answer, certainly if it's an area that you're not familiar with, right? But you know exactly how to find that answer, right? And to find an answer and to provide the answer in a way that will be most useful for the company. In other words, not just here is the black letter law answer, but here is the answer, and this is how it applies to your business, and this is how you can use the answer to be successful, right? And that extra step, that making a recommendation to your client, right, on how to use the legal knowledge that you're providing, I think that's the extra bit. That's what kind of separates maybe the good from the great, hopefully, right? And that's what, in my experience, certainly American companies, American clients are looking for, which is, and that's why, I talk about this a bit, that in the US, the phrase for hiring a lawyer, it's take advice of counsel, right? And I think that underscores what's going on there, is that when you're out hiring a lawyer, when you're seeking to get a legal answer, what you're asking for is advice of counsel, which is please advise on what your recommended course of action is. And you cannot effectively provide a recommended course of action unless you've got the broader context and the broader understanding of a range of things, not just the technical legal answer. Right. And again, I do think a lot of that comes from the training, and I'm just going to give a shout out to my professors who always said we're teaching you how to learn how to think like a lawyer. Yeah, I mean, how to think critically and to provide an answer that is highly useful in context.
It's interesting because I'm actually seeing parallels to what I've taught at business schools when I've taught tech for non-technical founders or tech for business leaders, because people assume that I'm going to tell them how to teach a specific tool. And I mean, most of the time, I have no idea, so I'm not the person to learn that. But it's all about, okay, you're in a world where technology is constantly changing. Things are constantly changing. So you need to, but like that doesn't matter. The tool doesn't matter because it's going to be a different tool in a year's time. What matters is linking technology strategy to your business goals, asking the right questions, and also, as you said, knowing how to find the right answer. And sometimes that means knowing the right specialist. And so knowing who the right specialist is to build your thing, and knowing that, for example, don't hire a back-end developer if what you really want to focus on is kind of a beauty on your front end screens. And if you understand how that works, essentially you kind of have, enough to be a leader in today's age, which is not the same as, go and learn Python, because, Python is really useful now. Is it going to be useful in 5 years' time? I have no idea. And sorry,
No,
go on,
and
yes.
a little bit of that, right, is from a lawyer standpoint, is making the analogies, right, between companies that have come before, used analogous technologies, talk about how companies dealt with previous disruptions in the market. And yet the specifics are different, and the specific technologies may change, but some of the dynamics are very, very similar. And here, I'll give you an example of this just from maybe more of a business standpoint. Is so I've been practicing since the late '90s, and so I've been through sort of three of the real kind of up and down cycles. Right, first being the late '90s into the early 2000s, the internet boom, and then the 0809 financial crisis, and then sort of the recent downturn after the highs of 2020 and 2021. And I talk to companies all the time about this who have maybe only been through one or maybe two of these cycles, and there's a lot to learn, right, from what we've seen on prior cycles. Like, for example, that often some of the best companies get created on the downsides of these cycles. Some of the best times to be a seed investor or an A investor tend to be on the downsides of these cycles. And being able to share some of those lessons, even though the specifics might be different, right? It might be the current exuberance over AI versus the current exuberance over the .com, right, in the late '90s. But there are similarities there that can be shared and hopefully be instructive.
It's funny what you say about investors, because I used to work in a private equity firm, and I actually remember we had this slide deck when we were fundraising. So we had to go to limited partners because, private equity people also have to fundraise. And we literally had this slide that said, "We are ambulance chasers." And there was this really gruesome picture of an ambulance and a guy running after it. And basically, it meant that, I think at the time we were just coming out of the Great Recession. And essentially, our pitch was, this is the time to invest. Yes, this feels scary, but when it doesn't feel scary, that's exactly the time when you shouldn't invest. And generally, it wasn't a particularly nice place to work, but they were very successful. So I remember when we spoke recently, you enlightened me about US versus UK lawyers, and my mind was boggled. So I would love to share that insight with the audience. So what is the core difference between working with a lawyer in the US versus the UK?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily the difference working with the lawyers so much as it is that the legal system creates different incentives and disincentives um, in the U.S. versus the UK, and I think that results in a bit of an impact um, as to kind of what sort of advice is sought. And here's what I mean by that, right? In the UK, um, if we, Sophia, had a business dispute, we went to court, right? Um, whoever loses would have to pay, most or all of the other side's legal fees. Typically, that's it's funny. I always say in American law schools that's taught as the English rule because that's how they do it in England, right? Um, and that creates a pretty substantial disincentive to go to court, right? Unless you are pretty much absolutely certain that you're going to win, because then you're going, as I often say, double or nothing, right? And
Hmm.
that seems fairly risky unless you are very certain that you're going to prevail. And frankly, how often is any one party that certain, right? I mean, they may be, right? And you do say it, but at least you think twice, right? But that also means that the sort of maybe letter writing that you might see a lot in the United States, the sort of the threats that you might see between business competitors or otherwise around threatening legal actions, you don't see as much in the United Kingdom on average. Why? And again, I think it has to do with some of the disincentives there, right? Like it if it's unlikely that you're actually going to end up in court, right? It makes the letter writing seem a little bit um, less threatening, right?
Hmm.
And so you don't see it as much, and so that creates a certain dynamic, right? Where um, it's a little bit less litigious. Whereas in the United States, if we had a business dispute and we went to court, the default is each side bears their own costs, even if they win, right? And that creates a certain dynamic. Well, let's imagine that I had more money to spend than you do on a claim. Well, you know, as long as I can come up with any sort of claim that kind of gets over the threshold of not being frivolous, right? Then I can put you in a pretty challenging position. By threatening you, I can put you in a position where your choices are go to court and beat me, but now you're out a substantial amount of legal fees. And American litigation often is more expensive than elsewhere in the world, right? And you're not going to get you generally. I mean, there are exceptions, but you generally won't get that reimbursed, even if you win. But then your other option then would be to settle on my terms, which also is bad, right? So how do you navigate that? And I always say, as a public service announcement, um, millions of companies are creating trillions of dollars worth of gross domestic product in the United States every year. So somebody is figuring out how to navigate this dynamic, right? And that's where you get into the take advice of counsel, the advisory model, right? Because to keep companies out of that position, the American model when providing legal advice is at the core to answer one core question. How does the company achieve its goals? Let's say achieve their business goals while managing risk, right? Because if you just focus on business goals without being sensitized to legal considerations, then it's too easy in the U.S. to get blindsided, or I often say to get run over by the litigation train, right? To get blindsided a bit by the dynamic that I just raised for you. I mean, you're between a kind of a rock and a hard place. But if you just focused on legal risk in the United States, well, then you sort of get wrapped around the axle a little bit, but potentially because it seems like, well, you know, the U.S. is certainly a higher risk environment. I mean, just look at insurance companies. I often talk to UK and European companies about this. That when they go out and look for global business insurance policies, they find that there's a default exclusion for the United States, right? Because of the different environment there. So that's the sort of the key point of advice, which is how does the company achieve its business goals while managing risk, which requires somebody who's advising to have both a business hat on and a legal hat on. And
Mhm.
as an aside, it also means that business people in the US tend to be a little bit more sensitized to legal matters than you might see in other parts of the world, because it kind of, permeates everyday business life in a way that you don't see elsewhere. Like in most other environments, there's kind of a bit of a harder break between the business and the legal, whereas in the US, business and legal are almost inextricably intertwined in a way that seems a little bit unusual oftentimes to companies going to the US from outside, but in the US, it's kind of our native environment.
So this actually makes sense because I remember in my first company, I had US and UK investors, and my US investors would say to me, well, who's the law firm? Who's your lawyer? Who is representing you? And my UK investors, it didn't even enter your mind because, well, why do we care who drafts the agreement? Like we discuss the term sheet, we discuss the terms, and then they put it into legal language. And like, why do we care who does that? And I remember, I used to be a huge fan of The Good Wife. And I thought, basically, this is what it's going to be like. You get this lawyer, they're like your best friend in a suit who can also sue people on your behalf. They're like your best friend with superpowers. I was really looking forward to having that.
The two different systems incentivize different behavior, right? Like, I mean, I've heard this sort of the same sort of thing when you said that your investors said, well, you need someone to draft the documents. So yeah, I mean, then they need to be drafted well, but without an environment that has the incentives of the U.S. environment, it's seen as at least maybe from your investor standpoint, that it might be seen as a very limited legal task. Whereas in the US, it's seen as a much broader task, which is, let's talk about what the term sheet should say in the first place, right? Both in terms of, for example, what's market standard. And the lawyers, and certainly in the US, are often in a very good position to be able to talk about what's market standard just because of the number of deals that we see. I mean, for example, Wilson Sonsini puts out a quarterly publicly available report on what we see as market standard term sheets, right? And that is, very common in the US, that for that group of law firms that are, heavily working on at the venture stage and later, right? But are also working at the venture stage, that the support on the term sheet comes in a couple different ways, right? It comes from the perspective of what is market out there? How does your deal look relative to the hundreds or thousands of other deals, that we've been seeing? And then second, and this goes back to what we were talking about starting with the VCs in the 60s and going till now, being able to see around corners a little bit. How do these terms play out on the next few rounds? And most importantly, on the exit, right? And you only have that perspective if you've gone on the journey before, so that you see how the terms that you might have at seed or Series A play out not only on the B and the C, but how they eventually play out, on the IPO or the M&A sale. And if you have that whole perspective, then you can better, and I'll use the verb again, you can better advise the company on the term sheet at the seed and the A, if that makes sense.
With this difference between is a lawyer a strategic advisor or a drafter of documents, this is where this discussion about what are large language models doing to the legal industry and what's this disruption going to look like. I think that discussion is really pertinent because essentially if it's document drafting, well, that is going to be really disrupted by technology. It already is. But if it's strategic advice, well, we haven't yet figured out how to do that with technology. That is a uniquely human skill. So I wonder if, therefore, the US law firm system is kind of more safe than the UK law firm system from this tech disruption. What do you think of that assumption?
So I mean, I'm a little bit more familiar, obviously, with the U.S. perspective, and what I would say is that we certainly as a firm are embracing technology. AI is not itself going to take jobs, right? It's that the people who know how to use AI, right, are going to have the advantage. And I think that that's probably the right way to look at it, is that if you are viewing the world as looking to provide strategic advice, AI is a tool that helps you provide better strategic advice.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think the listeners are going to love it too. So, listeners, if you do love it, which I'm sure you do, then what you need to do is leave this fascinating podcast a 5-star rating and a great review, and that will make my day. So, thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, Sophia.